The New Orleans Pelicans still don't really have a starting center on the roster, but I'm going to tell you how exactly they're going to get one. And yes, Brandon Ingram is key to that. Plus, I'll tell you exactly what a trade exception is and why the Pelicans valued it over Jonas Valanciunas. It's the Monday episode of Locked On Pelicans. Let's go.
You are Locked On Pelicans, your daily New Orleans Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another edition of Locked On Pelicans, the daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Pelicans and NBA, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, available wherever you get your podcasts and available on YouTube. I'm your host, Pelicans Insider, credential member of the media, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. Here with y'all on this Monday. We got a lot to cover this week on Locked On Pelicans. We got a jam-packed show on Locked On Pelicans today. We're going to look at how Brandon Ingram, whether you want him to or not, is the key to the Pelicans getting a starting center and why you shouldn't worry about the Pelicans not being active in free agency right now. Then we'll look at Jonas Valanciunas. It turns out he was signed and traded to the Washington Wizards, with the Pelicans basically giving him up for free, but getting a trade exception. I'll explain what that is and why it's valuable to New Orleans, then a couple of other notes at the end of today's show. So, of course, thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. In today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more as playoffs wind down and sports stop sporting like we want them to. This summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a booster bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. So let's get into this. This, I think, is kind of one of the bigger things around the team at the moment, and that's the Pelicans don't have a starting center. Right? They drafted Yves Missi, but let's not say he's ready for that role just yet. Maybe, hopefully, by the end of the regular season. But on opening night, the Pelicans starting center is a big old question mark right now. But I don't think you need to worry that you're seeing free agency basically come and go for New Orleans. And so this show is going to be kind of heavily focused on some salary cap and collective bargaining agreement, kind of the inner workings of the NBA and how all of these transactions work. So before we get into this part, I got to explain one thing when it comes to the Pelicans' salary, because they don't have a ton of flexibility right now. Right now, the way I have it is the Pelicans are hard capped at the first apron. There's a number in terms of salary that they are literally not allowed to exceed. They are not allowed to go over $178,132,000 in salary. Right now, they're at $167,605,880 by my estimate. So that gives them about let's call it $10.5 million that they can have on their roster in terms of salary, and they cannot go over that number. So here's how this impacts a Brandon Ingram trade and why you're not seeing the Pelicans sign players to minimum deals. They are hard capped at that number and cannot really go over that. So any signing you make right now, is going to come out of that $10.5 million that they could spend. They can only sign guys on minimum exceptions or using the non-taxpayer mid-level exception. So say they signed $10 million worth of players. Let's say they signed Andre Drummond to a $5 million deal. And let's say they signed Paul Reed to a $5 million deal. Hypothetical. Drummond has signed with the Sixers. Paul Reed, I do think, would be a very good option for New Orleans. More on him maybe later in the week. So say they spend the $10 million there. So now they're basically at the hard cap number. They cannot take back more salary onto this team. What that then does is limit you on a Brandon Ingram trade. The way trades work in the NBA when you're an over-the-cap team, which the Pelicans are, is that you have to make more or less, if you're sending out, Brandon Ingram makes $36 million. If you send him out, you need to take back $36 million, plus or minus a certain amount here. So they could bring back maybe $38 million worth of players in a Brandon Ingram deal, $39 million in a Brandon Ingram trade, $3 million, $2 million over what they have on the books with him right now. But if they sign $10 million worth of players, they can't take back more salary. What that then does is limit your trade options for Brandon Ingram. So if you're wondering if you want the Pelicans to sign somebody, but also want them to trade Brandon Ingram, those two things are kind of mutually exclusive, I think, when it comes to this right now. What would you prefer? Minimum veteran center signings, because that's all the Pelicans are really going to get right now, or more options for a Brandon Ingram trade? Or maybe you're just someone who doesn't want them to trade Brandon Ingram, and that's fair too. Because the bigger move for this team, what's going to be most impactful is a Brandon Ingram trade. Not signing Drummond, not signing Paul Reed. Paul Reed would be nice. I don't disagree with that. But let's not say that he's the difference maker between making a conference finals or not. It's what you would get in the Brandon Ingram trade is what's really going to potentially, hopefully, put this team over the top. I want as many options on the table when it comes to that. And I don't mean more options in terms of teams that they could trade with, but more combinations with teams that they're already maybe in talks with. And let's look at the Cleveland Cavaliers here. And I do think it's most likely that they're going to end up trading Brandon Ingram in some sort of deal for Jarrett Allen. Jarrett Allen makes $20 million. The Cavs are going to need to send out close to $36 million. Maybe the way this deal gets done is it's Max Strus, who makes about 15, so you're just under that threshold. Or you got to maybe add something other than Max Strus for Jarrett Allen or for Brandon Ingram to make this deal work. The Pelicans wouldn't be able to do that. It limits the amount of things that you can bring back and thus limits the options on what you could trade Brandon Ingram for. I don't want someone, and let's use Andre Drummond as an example because I think he's the best one of this. I don't want Andre Drummond limiting what I could trade Brandon Ingram for, because the more impactful move is not going to be Andre Drummond. It's going to be what you would trade Brandon Ingram for. Does that make sense? I know when it comes to the salary cap and these things, it's a little bit complicated, but because the Pelicans are pushed up against a hard cap, and I don't mind that they're hard cap, they were always going to be hard cap this season no matter what. You've got to kind of factor in what's the most impactful thing, and let's create the most options with that. So that's why you haven't seen them sign any of these guys. Look, James Wiseman, whatever. He signed for a minimum deal. He's barely in the league here. He's the third center on the Indiana Pacers. That was not the guy that was going to make a difference for this team. Could he have started? Sure. Would he have been good? No, he hasn't been good his whole career. A reclamation project? Sure, but do the Pels need to take that on? Or, as we talked about, and we'll talk more about the Dejounte Murray trade because it's official and we have an update on that in the third segment here, because you didn't trade Brandon Ingram for a guard, as I've said repeatedly on the show, think bigger. You don't need to think small like Brandon Ingram, Goga Bitadze, or any of those guys that we were talking ourselves into, myself included in that. You can think much bigger and work to find a deal. More on Brandon Ingram and his contract and all of that in tomorrow's show that I want to get into of why he probably is going to need to take less money and potentially stay here. But then that's not a bad situation for New Orleans either. But the reason they haven't signed anyone is the bigger domino for them, for this team, is a Brandon Ingram trade. And even if you don't get max value for Brandon Ingram, you're going to get more value than what someone like Andre Drummond. Man, it makes me sound like Andre Drummond's a scrub, and he's not, but he's not particularly amazing anymore. Can do for this team. And that's the most important thing. And I actually like that the Pelicans front office is valuing the flexibility to get the best return possible for this team in a Brandon Ingram deal, rather than making short-sighted moves and hurting themselves or limiting the options for a Brandon Ingram trade, because we don't know what might come down the line in a little bit, and you want to keep that flexibility open. So flexibility is kind of key for this team. And we talked a little bit about the hard cap here, the first apron. We didn't even get into the luxury tax. We don't need to here. For all intents and purposes, the Pelicans are going to be a luxury tax team this season, which good. But the Jonas Valanciunas trade was intriguing. The Pelicans got a second-round pick back for him in a sign-and-trade deal. But if they traded him and he's only making $10 million, why not keep him? I'll explain why and why they valued a traded player exception over Jonas Valanciunas, and I'll explain exactly what a traded player exception is and why that matters somewhat to the New Orleans Pelicans this coming season. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. I love sports, and I love them so much I never want them to stop. But if the playoffs wind down and we get fewer games, and the sports aren't sportsing like we want them to, FanDuel is going to let me keep the sports going whenever I want, and all I have to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime I'm in the mood. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or bonus daily. That's right, there's something for everyone every day all summer long. Look, basketball's not going on, but you got the Olympics around the corner. You have a lot of soccer going on right now, and of course there's Major League Baseball. So head over to FanDuel and start making the most of your summer. FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball and the official sportsbook of Locked On. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. We are the #1 Pelicans podcast, so it's a lot of fun breaking down everything for you, giving you insight into the salary cap, the collective bargaining agreement, breaking down the Dejounte Murray trade, what they could do with Brandon Ingram, and all of that. Let me know what you think. Do you just want them to sign someone and limit some of the trade options with Brandon Ingram? Or would you rather them do what they're doing right now, which is trying to find the best deal? And more on that a little bit later in the weeks. Might be getting an update or two, and I'll share some insight into what's going on there. And now for your second listen today, Locked On Saints with host Ross Jackson. Training camp is around the corner for the Saints. They're going to be in Irvine, California. Ross Jackson is going to be there, breaking it all down on the Locked On Saints podcast. Subscribe wherever you get your podcast and on YouTube, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So let's get into the Jonas Valanciunas deal, a traded player exception. Is that exciting? Is it not? What's it even mean if you don't know? So one of the things, let's get this part out of the way first. The Pelicans didn't want Jonas Valanciunas back, and Jonas Valanciunas did not want to be back here in New Orleans. So you see him sign for $10 million with the Washington Wizards, but he wasn't coming back because he didn't want to. He was going to probably take less money to go elsewhere. Say the Pelicans were like $13 million a year, 3 more than what you're making right now. There was no way that he was coming back here. He didn't like that he didn't close games, that they went with Larry Nance Jr. with him. And frankly, paying a guy 10 to 15 million, 15 being what JV made last season, to not close games is just not someone you want on your roster. That limits your flexibility, that limits the guys that you could trade for, all of those things. So this was just going to be a parting for both sides of this. So that's part of the reason. But luckily, the Pelicans didn't let him walk for nothing. What happened here is something called a sign-in trade, where because basically the Wizards and the Pelicans both did each other a favor. The Wizards had cap space. They could have just signed Jonas Valanciunas into their cap space or using one of their, mid-level exceptions, and the Pelicans would have gotten nothing in return. Instead, it was a sign-in trade where the Wizards had a traded player exception, and I'll explain that here in a second, and the Pelicans signed and traded Jonas Valanciunas into that traded player exception. Now, when two teams make a trade, you got to send something back, and the Washington Wizards sent back a Chicago Bulls 2027 second-round pick that is protected 30 through 50, or 31 through 50. Basically what that is it's a fake second-round pick. That is a pick that will not convey to New Orleans. When you put protections on a pick, you usually hear lottery protected, top 14 protected on a first-round pick. That means that if it's in that top 14, the original team keeps it, and maybe it changes to something later down the line. When you put protections on a second-round pick, it doesn't really turn into anything else. You just don't get it. So this pick being protected for the top 20 picks of the second round likely means that the Pelicans aren't going to get it. Essentially, with it being protected, 31 through 50, it needs to fall 51 through 60, so a 10-pick range from the Chicago Bulls. That's essentially a top 10 record in the league for the Chicago Bulls in 2 seasons, 3 seasons, whatever it might be. Look at their roster. That's not happening. You just have to give something back to make trades work, but it doesn't mean that thing needs to convey. And instead, what was valuable to the Pelicans here was the traded player exception, because they sent out salary and didn't bring salary back. There's ways you can do that. And in this case, the Pelicans think of it like a coupon. think of a traded player exception like a coupon for the amount that's like the difference. And in this case, it's $9.9 million. So, and these traded player exceptions last for 1 year from the date that the transaction happens. So you can use them for 1 full year. And then they're gone. They expire. Just like if you don't use a coupon by a certain date or a gift card, it's gone, right? That's kind of what you have here. What this allows the Pelicans to do is acquire a player up to $9.9 million without sending salary out. And that's kind of the key here. Say the Pelicans trade Brandon Ingram for $36 million for one player making $36 million. They still have 3 roster spots that they need to fill. Say there's no one in free agency that they want to sign. Say they want to trade for a player that's making, call it $8 million. They don't have a way to go and get that guy without sending salary out. Normally you would need, if you want to trade for a guy making $8 million, send $8 million out. This traded player exception gets around that a little bit. They could do kind of what the Wizards did. They could acquire a player in a trade, not a free agent, but a player in a trade for $8 million, up to $9.9 million without sending any salary back. Because think about it. If they need to fill 3 more spots on their roster and you trade for a guy, well, you're not adding to that roster total. You still need to then acquire 3 more players and you don't really have the money to do so. So this is a way to get a more impactful player, trade for a player without losing a player in the first place. Say you absorb 1 player into the traded player exception. You give up a fake second round pick, right? Because that team doesn't want this guy on the roster anymore for whatever reason. Now you only need to fill 2 spots instead of still it being 3. The traded player exception, there's some criteria that you should know about them. You can use it to acquire multiple guys. You could use a $5 million worth of this and then 4.4 later. You cannot combine multiple traded player exceptions into one thing. So if you have a traded player exception for $5 million and $10 million, you can't use that to acquire a $15 million player. And you can't use them with, say, Brandon Ingram making $36 million and then this one for $10 million to go get a player that's making 46. They kind of have to be used by themselves for a single transaction. But that gives the Pelicans more flexibility to maybe go trade for a center making $10 million or so. You can give up a first-round pick for that sort of guy now and then not have to give up really anything else. You can give up real things or not, but this is a way to make it work. I'm actually curious, how much does Wendell Carter Jr. make this coming season? It doesn't work. He makes $12 million, so he doesn't fit into this. But say Wendell Carter Jr. made $9.9 million. The Pelicans can't really afford to give up a player in a deal with him that's making that because they don't really have anyone like that. Really, the only player, you'd have to give up Trey Murphy and Jordan Hawkins to essentially equal $10 million. Well, you could just trade a first-round pick for Wendell Carter Jr., absorb him into this traded player exception, and now you don't need to send anybody out. And that's also a way that the Pelicans might get their starting center or another player that's going to help them. Because Jonas Valanciunas was never coming back. He didn't want to be here. And if the Pelicans weren't using him in the way, you may as well go get a starting center that you're going to use and give those minutes to a guy that you particularly like or value. This is a good way to maybe go and get another player, starting center or otherwise. So I know this was a little confusing and I probably didn't do the best job of explaining, but I hope that makes it a little bit more clear what exactly a traded player exception is and why it's valuable to this Pelicans team right now. This way, they don't have to send out salary for a guy that maybe they like, and they could just send a pick and absorb a guy into this traded player exception. And given where they are with the salary cap, that's a particularly important note for this Pelicans team right now. Do you agree with Lennon? Again, JV was going to walk. You can agree or disagree. It was just going to happen. There was no way he was going to end up coming back to this team. So kind of how it goes, but I don't really care about the fake second-round pick because that'll never actually, in my opinion, convey to the Pelicans. If it does, great. If not, who cares? The bigger thing was because you were going to let him walk for nothing, you got a traded player exception, which maybe allows you to get another player here. Essentially because the Wizards did this because they wanted to use their non-taxpayer mid-level exception on another player. They could have used that to sign Jonas Valanciunas, but because they happen to have a traded player exception, put him into the traded player exception, let them keep their non-taxpayer mid-level exception, And you got to give the Pelicans something back, but they got something. A fake second-round pick and the traded player exception, which to them I think they find more valuable. That gives them a year. This allows them to do something at the trade deadline too. It doesn't have to be right now in the summer off season. It can be later down the line. Maybe there's a player that just doesn't work, whatever it might be for another team. They can go and get that guy. So coming up next, a couple interesting notes. One, Jose Alvarado going to the Olympics here, which is pretty awesome. We'll break that down and why I think that's actually really important for him. And then the other part is, the Dejounte Murray trade is official. There was another piece added to it, but there's also something going on with numbers. We'll break that down coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by our sponsor, BetterHelp. Do you often tend to I'm going to ask you a question because this came up in conversation a lot recently. Do you tend to compare your life to others? Does social media play a part in that? And what do you do when you caught up in wishing your life looked like someone else's? This is something I think is just very human, something we all do. But comparison is a thief of joy, and it's easy to envy other people's lives. And it might look like they have it all together on their Instagram, but in reality, they probably don't. So therapy can help you focus on what you want instead of what others have, so you can start living your best life. So therapy isn't just for people who've experienced major trauma. Life doesn't come with an instruction manual, and sometimes you just need someone to talk to either get things off your chest or find ways to kind of work through what's bothering you. So again, you can go back to being the best version of you. So if you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. You just fill out a brief questionnaire and you get matched with a licensed therapist. You can switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. I love it that it's online. I've used it before. I don't have time to go to doctor's offices, drive there, sit, wait, then go in. I want that therapy. It's very good for you. But sometimes it just needs to be more convenient. BetterHelp is the way to do that. So stop comparing and start focusing with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA to get started. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. And now for your second listen, you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day long? Do you have to turn down the volume with all the shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the yelling. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So let's wrap up the show with a couple of just kind of like fun, happy notes. Let's start with this one. The Dejounte Murray trade is official. It's gone through. It is done. It has not been expanded. It did not really need to be expanded. There was a part missing, and the Pelicans filled that by signing and trading Cody Zeller to the Atlanta Hawks to make the math work, to make it work under the collective bargaining agreement, the CBA, and all of that. So that is kind of set now. It ends up being a sign and trade with Cody Zeller, Larry Nance Jr., Dyson Daniels, EJ Liddell, and then 2 future first-round picks to the Atlanta Hawks for Dejounte Murray, answering kind of the biggest question, one of the biggest questions we had about the Pelicans, which is the point guard position. That is set. He is in New Orleans, from what I've been told here, and very excited. On social media, he's been doing all of the right things, posting about, you've seen him working out, wearing New Orleans Pelicans gear and all of that. It's just nice because I think if you're a longtime listener or you've just been a longtime fan of the team, do you remember, it's going to age me because I was covering the team back then. This is how long I've been doing it here. Do you remember when Eric Gordon, Al-Farouq Aminu, and Chris Kaman was traded to the New Orleans Pelicans in that deal for Chris Paul? Because I do. And do you remember all of their faces, particularly Eric Gordon? He's hated here. His face of just at their introductory press conference holding up their jerseys and just looking so sad that they were not playing for the Clippers and now we're playing for the New Orleans Pelicans. This is also somewhat of a dark time, I think, in franchise history. They practiced at the Alario Center out in Bayou Signet, Westwego area, and sometimes they wouldn't be able to practice because there was the circus at the Alario Center, and they weren't able to practice because that like superseded an NBA team. Things used to be real bad here with this franchise. You want them to be cheap. They used to be cheap. They are not anymore since Tom Benson took over. That was definitely something that was, a real thing here. So to see a guy get traded here and just be excited to be on the team, to be pumped to be on the team, I think it's like a wonderful thing. You don't always get that in these small markets. And Dejounte Murray doing all of those things is going to make him an instant fan favorite. We'll have more on him and kind of what I think he's going to add to this team later in the week too, because now that it's official, we can really kind of break down his play with Zion, with others, and what this is going to look like and what it's going to do for New Orleans next season. But I'm just happy that he wants to be here. The other big news with Dejounte Murray, and this sucks if you have a Herb Jones jersey, is it sounds like, and Fletcher Mackel tweeted this out, that Dejounte Murray tweeted out, Herb Jones is a real one. It was like, oh, Dejounte Murray wears 5. He has always worn 5. Herb Jones wears 5 for New Orleans. Well, he just gave Dejounte Murray his number, and Fletcher Mackel confirmed that Herb Jones is going to be switching to the number 2 next year. So if you have a Herb Jones jersey or you want the most current one, it's going to have a different number. And hopefully there's a way to kind of convert maybe Herb Jones jerseys to a Dejounte Murray jersey. But this is like the most Herb Jones thing ever. Normally what you have to do is kind of like a player coming to a new team like buys the number. They got to give some money to the current player, the incumbent with that number. What do you think Herb Jones like actually requested money for? It was just like, yeah, sure, it doesn't really bother me. Take this number. It'll mean more to you. Because Herb Jones is just the chillest dude you could possibly imagine. He was probably just like, buy me a couple of new fishing poles and I'll be totally good here. And that's how probably this number swap went down or something like that. The other note here, so this means I wanted to get a Herb Jones City Edition jersey this year with the black and didn't actually get one. I will be getting a brand new Herb Jones jersey next season for sure. The other note here is the Pelicans at one point didn't have any players in the Olympics, but now Jose Alvarado with Puerto Rico has made the Olympics and is going to be playing for them this summer in Paris, and I think that is freaking awesome. He was also the MVP of the qualifying tournament to get in there and the best player on that team, at times coming off the bench. This is really cool. One, it's just cool to have him chasing in the Olympics and in the running for anything, and that's just fun. And this type of basketball is some of the highest level international basketball that you can get. Team USA is sending a stacked roster here. This, I think, can be a stepping stone for Jose. Again, one of my favorite players, as you can see here, on the team. I love this dude, and he keeps proving doubters, including myself at times, wrong every step of the way. I am just so happy for him to go and have this experience and gives us a rooting interest during the Olympics outside, for me, of Team USA. I also think this can be a pretty big stepping stone for him. Look at a guy like Anthony Edwards, who kind of really arrived on the scene with Team USA last summer as their best player, kind of leading the team. And he carried that form into the regular season here. One of the things you want to see these guys do is not like take too much time off of basketball, get a little bit rusty. We've seen it with Zion in the past. Playing at high level basketball, yes, might mean you're a little bit tired at the start of the season, and the season's going to be long because of that. But it also means you're going to be in top form when the season starts. For Jose, who's going to have a big role on this team, I think, is kind of the backup point guard for him now that they've got Dejounte Murray in. His role is very solidified, and if he has a really good run here, this could elevate his game. Like, this is the type of thing that can absolutely be a big stepping stone for guys to carry that form over during the regular season. It's why we wanted to see Zion Williamson play with Team USA. And he was never going to make this Olympic roster because they're going with like the stalwarts, the guys who've done it, who have Olympic golds and want to do it one more time. But in the future, it would be great to see Zion Williamson play with Team USA. And one of the things I've gotten from in the past about that heard, and it's a bit rumorish, is that maybe that's just not what he wants to do during the offseason. And he doesn't have the opportunity to do it here, so we're not knocking him for not doing it. But I'd like to see him do that in the future because I think he could come into the season in very good shape and light up the league from game one rather than trying to get his legs under him. And I'm hopeful we'll see that with Jose Alvarado. And I know we're all going to be rooting for him during the Olympics. You rooting for him? You rooting for someone else? Let me know what you think about the Olympic basketball tournament in the comments down below. So more tomorrow on Brandon Ingram. The contract, why he's probably, no matter where he ends up, going to need to take less money, and why that maybe is going to be a good thing for him long term. We're going to look at all of that coming up here next or in like future shows, not next, not like the next segment here, of Locked On Pelicans. More on Dejounte Murray as well. As always, I'm your host, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter, and I'll be back with y'all tomorrow.